Hello, everyone. This is John Scott, one of the founders of ScopeStack, and with me today I have Lyf Wildenberg from Mytech. So Lyf is the CEO of Mytech, and he's one of the most process-oriented people I think I've met, and executing at a very high level over at Mytech. So Lyf, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the business, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Lyf Wildenberg from Mytech. I'm one of the co-founders here at Mytech Partners. Been in business since 2000. We would identify ourselves as a managed services provider. Along with that, we do a fair amount of project implementations for our customers, roughly 90-ish employees across 2 locations, with about 30% of our revenue coming from project services.
Awesome. So I think that's an interesting piece, right? That you are identifying yourself as a managed services provider, yet you're still doing a decent amount of project-based work, right? It's like, what's the important to your business in that project-based work as it relates to the recurring piece? Why is it so important?
Yeah, by and large, the project work that we do is for our managed services customers. We've gotten to a point in our managed services offering where we have a reference architecture that we ask our clients to adhere to. So a very specific stack that we want them to adopt over time through our managed program. So customers that have been with us 3, 4, or 5 years probably have adopted our whole reference architecture. We are, the amount that we can train across multiple vendors and multiple solutions gets difficult. So that's why we ask our clients to stay within, certain technologies. For instance, we choose 2 primary firewall vendors, SonicWall and Fortinet. And we typically have a primary and a secondary, but we would ask our customers to adopt one of those hardware vendors because it's where our staff is highly trained and where we make investments. And so that just, all of that work that we do for our managed services eventually comes through life cycle management, where we have to replace core infrastructure, we have to migrate customers to Azure 365, following just some modern, infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. That's what generates the vast majority of our project work, and trying to really build off of that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, right? I mean, I think we've been working together for about 2 years now, I think at this point, pretty close. And I think initially I think you signed up a long time ago, and then you got off, and then you came back. You're like, we try to fix it, this problem for ourselves. So maybe could you tell us like what the problem was that you were trying to solve as an MSP, and then essentially what led you to ScopeStack, right? And again, I'm not even trying to like sell ScopeStack in this moment, but what was the problem and what were you trying to solve?
Yeah, I think ultimately, so we take the approach, as many MSPs do, or people that have companies that have gone through this kind of maturity model of trying to standardize the 80% and humanize the 20%. And what we were finding is that time to get a scope out when we're doing projects was taking too long. We were starting over basically from scratch every time, or maybe reusing an Excel template or a Word template and trying to, go from there. We also we're doing too much gut and feel on our pricing model. So, hey, this time we think it's going to take 20 hours, and the next time we thought it was going to take 30 hours, and we didn't have a systematic way to go back and say, here's the effort that's being put in. Let's standardize the work and standardize the pricing so that we aren't overcharging or undercharging, and then also having a way to loop back later and measure against what we actually scoped in. So we're doing too much by gut and feel, and we wanted to standardize that, make it more efficient. And then as our organization was growing, I was having more people play that scoping role. and I needed them to scope likewise in my Minnesota location and my Colorado location.
Right.
And so that the real problem was that we were solving was how do we scope efficiently and accurately and consistently across our organization.
Yeah, so like regardless of who's doing that activity, right? So I think that's the important part, and I'm curious as to because your organization is growing, you're executing at a very high level. Is it because you're growing that that became so painful? Like, and then I guess my follow-up question is, do you foresee someone like is solving that problem later in your growth more painful than it is kind of foreseeing that
Yeah,
growth?
I mean, the way I tell our staff is if I would have been able to have this tool 5 years ago, I would have implemented it. Even
Got
when
it.
we had less people scoping and even following a process to do that. So I think it was a pretty big lift for us
Yeah.
at the point that we were when we implemented ScopeStack to kind of adopt a new methodology,
Right.
because I had to, for lack of better words, untrain a lot of bad habits
Yeah.
that we adopted in that. So I guess quick answer, I would have loved to have done it earlier. And we even went through a process, like you said, I looked at ScopeStack originally, and it was either maybe a timing thing for us, but I couldn't see how ScopeStack was going to solve the problem on the first pass. This is probably like
Yeah.
a year earlier. And I went and built my own tool, which was a very, very complex Excel spreadsheet that had work
All right.
breakdown structure, and you could choose a solution with all the work that needed to produce the solution and insert it, and with all these macros and everything. And that solved an interim problem, but then maintenance of that and keeping it up to date became the next challenge, where it
Yeah.
was almost as much work to maintain it as it was to build it.
Hmm.
And then I was on the hunt for how can I put this in a web form? How can I
Yeah.
share this, not an Excel spreadsheet across the organization, but have 3 or 4 solution architects in there building solutions, collaborating together, and Excel didn't cut it
Right.
anymore. And that's where we loop back, and you and I met up again. And I kind of showed you what you built, and you were like, or I built, and you were like, hey, we can do everything you're doing inside of ScopeStack. So that was the genesis of trying to figure that out is, maybe if I had one person only scoping, it's an Excel spreadsheet could have continued to work because I only had to share it with one person.
Yeah. Right.
But the maintenance of that, every time we wanted to iterate and come back and say, oh, well, we were off on this estimate of hours, I still had to go back and kind of reformat the whole solution inside of Excel as opposed to changing one part of a work breakdown structure or changing a part of a solution.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the same boat, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like every time I would write a statement of work, before that, I would go Google Cisco SAL automation, right? Like there's got to be something out there. And just there wasn't, right? Like there were proposal automation things out there. There were quoting tools out there, but there's nothing built around like calculating level of effort around services in in something that I could get my hands on very quickly, right? And so I think we had the exact same pain. So, all right. So you mentioned process. I've seen your process. You've walked me through your process. I try to write it down on a whiteboard, right? But you actually have this all mapped out. This is something that you communicate to your team. So as you're pulling that up, to like y'all are a ConnectWise managed shop, right?
Yeah,
And maybe kind of talk about the tech stack piece
sure.
of it,
Well,
maybe where ScopeStack fits in, and we can get into it.
yeah. So I mean, some of it it starts with what is our methodology and how we engage our clients, right? So
Yeah.
we have this concept where we can call them VCIOs, account managers, whatever. So that's basically our client-facing role, who owns the relationship. And so they are the ones that are doing the quarterly business reviews. We call them the mighty business reviews, make IT easy reviews, where we meet with our clients every quarter. And we are looking at life cycle management. We are looking at emerging technologies that they should be adopting and recommending projects. But if we just take like the life cycle piece, somebody might have, an on-prem server that we want to move up to Azure. And we said, okay, in Q2 of 2022, we're going to do that. The first stage for us is to be able to give them a ballpark estimate of what is this going to cost in either hardware, software, and services. And, so we want to try to minimize as much engineering time in we call it the high level budget or the budget review for the client to then to sign off. So that's our first stage is, and this is where we're just evolving with ScopeStack in our new process, is to be able to have enough standardization that our account managers or VCIOs can go in and do a high level budget based on the elements the solutions that we have standardized or set up inside of ScopeStack. And so they can go to the client in high level review and say, this is bigger than a bread box. We think this project is going to be about $20,000.
Yeah.
They can go and get approval and then come back and say, once we get approval, now we will start to dig in a much deeper level of the process, where we're actually going to generate a full scope, create a statement of work that can be signed off by the customer, create the quote. So the tech stack that we're using for this whole process really is a quoting tool. We use ConnectWise Sell.
Yep.
And we use ConnectWise Manage to do the project plan after we build the scope, and we use ScopeStack to build the scope, generate the scope of work, and then port it over to ConnectWise project with the whole work breakdown structure already created in the scope and budgeted time for the identified implementation task. Right. And also carve out how much PM time is it going to take, how much compliance documentation is that going to take. And then we, by and large, do everything fixed fee. So then we also build some governance on top of that to cover anything that the unexpected that might happen.
Contingency or, yeah.
Contingency, yep.
So the first three phases are, there's a little bit of scoping, but the majority of that is around qualification of the opportunity, discovery, and then budgeting for approval, right? Once the client says, hey, we're good with $20,000 budgetary, your team then comes in and says, all right, we're going to nail down the details around this project specifically and get you an actual executable statement of work. And that's the piece that you're doing inside of ScopeStack.
Yep,
right?
That sits right here in this 1 to 5 business days. And that's where we want to move quickly. Customers got budget approved. We know that time kills deals. And so we want to be able to turn a scope around quickly and accurately. So being able to use all the pre-defined work breakdown structure solution elements, we dump those together and then say, how is this different than our standard? And then we edit from the standard, okay, this is not 20 users in a 365 migration, that's 200 users. We can scale that up really quickly. And also then identify, are we having level 2 engineers do this task, level 3 engineers do this, my depot do another. And so I can break all that structure down ahead of time. So now my solution architect just has to plug it in, and we develop all the hours by role and the total hours to do the project.
So you said 1 to 5 business days. So once the client gives you approval, you're trying to, in 1 to 5 business days, get them a response back in the statement of work.
Yep. Statement of
Are
work with a quote to sign off on.
are you often within that time frame, or how are you in terms of success and tracking that
The only
KPI?
thing that would push that to the 5-day is a backlog, but we can
Mm,
generate most of the scopes based on how we have gone through our standard uh, implementation solutions. We can put a scope together typically in an hour
got it. Right. I
for
mean, and
almost any size project.
that was always so when you were talking about the early stage of, you're sitting there with the client, you're doing the QBR, you're talking about the projects. My dream was always, hey, I want to be sitting there in that client meeting and being able to generate some sort of budgetary number right there, right?
Yep.
As opposed to the way I used to do it, which is I take all these notes, I go back, I might have another meeting. It might be 2 days until I get even the time to sit down, right, and like put together some pricing, or not to mention the writing out a draft statement of work. So that's the problem that I think a lot of us are trying to solve, is exactly like you said, like time kills deals, right?
Yeah,
And you're also,
the big thing that took us time is, so we would have a standard statement of work that was soup to nuts, everything that we could ever think about for every project and
yeah,
solution type. And then we would start removing, well, I'm not doing a firewall on this one, so remove all of those assumptions, remove all of those responsibilities for the client, all that kind of stuff, where ScopeStack flipped it on its head. And as you add in the solutions, you're pulling in the assumptions, you're pulling in the client responsibilities, and able to work from there. So you
yeah,
start with a standard template of statement of work, and based on what you're selling, you're bringing in all those standard things that you typically would bring into the project, which is the exact reverse of what we were doing,
all right,
and having to like edit, pare out instead of add in, which I think is a much more efficient way to do it.
yeah, we think so. All right, so you scoped out a project. Now you're going through the technical details, and you've gone through proposal generation. You're presenting that to the client. Once the client says, "Hey, this is great. Let's move forward," what, like, in terms of like a business leader, right? Like, how important is it to have accurate handoff between the pre-sales team and the team delivering that work? Because the way I used to do it was, and again, really the back office chat around delivery in our entire organization. Oh, John or Tom or whoever scoped this project, what did they scope this time? Because there wasn't consistency, there wasn't a consistent process that we were following, and then we just hand them this document, say, hey, go deliver this for a client, right? And it really didn't set up anyone for success, much less our customer. So why is that important to you, or is it important to you?
Well, yeah, I would say that was one of the biggest pain points that I would dare to bet every MSP has, or anybody doing IT project work has, is that disconnect between presentation to the customer and the customer understanding what they're getting at a business level to the technical delivery. And being able to standardize the work breakdown, like our techs know, hey, when Mytech sells, a large enterprise firewall, here are the 15 things that are going to be part of a deliverable. It's always going to
Right.
happen on every single one. Then there could be another set of work breakdown that is additive to that. Like, we might say in a large firewall install, we're going to set up up to 10 site-to-site VPNs. So they know by default, when we sell that large enterprise firewall, there's going to be at least 10 site-to-site VPNs in there.
Yeah.
If there's 15, they're going to see an addition into the work breakdown structure. So it becomes very, very standardized on what they're going to expect, which then allows them to actually build out their project implementation plans consistently.
Yeah.
And then I would say the biggest thing that we found was because we don't get this right all the time, but when we have to make a change, they can go to that work breakdown structure and say, you know what, you're estimating 3 hours for this task, and it actually takes me 5. And
Right.
it's taken me 5 the last 3 times I've done it. Or sometimes they've come back to us and said, you're allocating 3 hours and it takes me 1 because we processed this out. We then will look back and say, well, if we can save the client money because of the effort that's going into it, should we do that? Sometimes it's a value proposition where we might not pass that to the customer, but it helps us stay competitive,
Oh yeah.
and so the clients stay captive with us.
Yeah, and I think if you're just putting this block of time around a task, right? So the way I know you all have that large firewall installed package built out is you have subservices or steps, if you will, built out underneath that. Some organizations, because they're trying to create the speed and the accuracy and maybe create SKUs or something like that, they'll say 40 hours for a large firewall install. But then you can't go in and say, oh, well, this is the thing that took extra time, or this is the step that took extra time, right? You just don't get that level of granularity, which is why the importance of, work breakdown, or a service list, you know?
Yeah, it's given us also common vernacular when
Mm,
our implementing engineers sit down and they look at the scope, they get the work breakdown structure that comes right over into ConnectWise. As they're building out what we call their implementation plan, how am I going to deliver this solution that is written up in the scope of work? Because the scope of work isn't necessarily at all how the engineer is going to implement. It is more put in a business realm of here's what the business solution we're going to provide to you, and the elements of that. And so it also allows them to say, okay, implementation steps for firewall I'm going to do on, day 1, and
right.
migration on day 2, and documentation on day 3. They can easily, at least in ConnectWise now, take those implementation steps and map those to their implementation plan, the work breakdown to the implementation plan.
Yeah, and where we're trying to go with it is something you also mentioned earlier, which is that closed loop, right? So now we have pre-sales to post-sales alignment through API integrations. We can push from ScopeStack that work breakdown directly into your PSA. Your PSA is managed. Where we want to come with that next is doing exactly what you said, taking it one step further and say, okay, all of my techs are entering their time, actual against that breakdown granular level of service. I want to be able to pull that back from manage and then give you a report, right? A pre-sales report, or a report for someone that's owning pre-sales and say, hey, how accurate are you, compared to, time estimated versus actual time to deliver.
And yeah, we give that responsibility to, or I should say accountability to our scoping engineer.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
they have to, the PMs, once a project is completed, they make sure all the time is put on the project plan by implementation steps. And then that gets ported out, and they look at what was budgeted to what was actual, and did we hit target or not. And we will look first at the high level. We budgeted
Yeah.
100 hours. Did we hit 100 hours? Or how much overrun did it have, or underrun? And then if we have a big enough delta, usually if we're in 5 to 10%, we say we hit target. But if we're at
Hmm.
10 to 20% anomaly on either side, we then dig further to say, where were we off? At what step were we off?
Yeah.
And this has actually created a lot of discipline that we had to put in time as we were doing things, because if you don't have the time, you can never get the data.
Right.
I mean, we can look at budget on or off by raw hours, or multiple of W2, but that's too macro. You can't start editing your services breakdown to go and say, hey, am I overcharged or undercharging for that firewall install, or that Azure migration, or the
Yeah.
365 migration? You need that level of granularity to start tuning that.
Yeah, absolutely. So since you've implemented this process, can you track, or can you put your finger on, a reduction in that delta and variance from scope time to deliverable time, or what are some of the business impacts that kind of fleshing out this process. And again, this is a journey, right? It's not an end state. I think there's iteration, constant iteration and measurement that happens. But how has this impacted the business?
So
I mean, I
I
think you
think
mentioned some of it.
initially, the easiest measurable is that we're turning scopes around faster.
Yeah.
Um, we're a year and a half in, and I would say we don't have enough. We have instances of data where we have gone back and said change the pricing. I don't know if we have enough reps across a lot of our solution stack to
Yeah.
have iterated a whole lot yet. I will tell you, by thinking through how we actually break down stuff, I bet you we are. This is not even. This is probably an underestimation. We realized as we went through and built our solution stacks out, we're probably 15 to 20% higher in our pricing because we went to a level to understand what effort it took to do everything, where we were gut and feel back of the napkin mathing the thing. And when we had to sit down and actually say, how long does it take you to do task A, B, C, D? We realized that we were missing a fair amount of effort. And we had to sit down with our engineers and actually say, hey, when you do this large firewall install, what are the 10 major steps that you go through? And then what's the effort from there?
Well, I think that's a really important piece, right? So ScopeStack we built it for the pre-sales team, right? So those that are responding to the sales process. But what I just heard you say is the post-sales, the delivery engineers, those folks doing the work have to be involved in that process up front so that when it gets to them, right, they're not surprised. This is not an exercise in pre-sales granted, I was that guy, right? I had done that work, 4 or 5 years ago. That has changed since I have since built that out. And so having that post-sales team involved in the process, would you say is
that's where the confidence comes in of using the tool, that where they can actually accept a scope and be okay with it because they were the driver that said, oh, it takes 2 hours to do this, or a half hour to do this, or an hour to do this. I came from an engineer background, and I will tell you, when you sit down with an engineer, when you ask them how long it takes to do something, they always underestimate because, oh, it's easy. It only take me 3 hours to do it. They don't think about the documentation. They don't think about the testing. They don't think about the cutover. They don't think about the timing until they're actually doing it. So if you can get your engineers to walk through that life cycle when you're building what the pre-sales is going to use, all of a sudden now you've taken out all of this ambiguity and all of that's where the tension comes, is because when you sit down with an engineer, they always say, I can do it and I can do it quick. But when they actually have to implement it, if you said, you told me 3 hours, well, that's the 3 hours that I was actually fingers on keyboard. It wasn't the planning. It wasn't the project management. It wasn't, the back and forth with the client and like all of that time comes into play. And that 3 hour project is actually a 10-hour project.
So it's really interesting, right? So like this process is not the result of it, right? Is an efficiency, but there was a business impact in the sense that your revenues are increased because you have a more accurate representation of the level of effort, right? Now that you have this process created.
And I can support that additional value that we're bringing to the customer by a much granular breakdown if I need to, and an effort in a way to demonstrate it to them as well. So it hasn't created a tension from the client perspective of, hey, now it feels like you're charging me more. They actually have better visibility into what we're doing, as opposed to, hey, that's a $2,000 project or a $20,000 project. Here's the end result. Most clients and customers care about the end result, but they also want to have the supporting value that's going behind it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and again, I've seen this process at a high level. We talked about this a long time ago, but I thought it was just kind of eye-opening to me, because this is the piece that a lot of both existing customers of ours, prospective customers, are trying to wrap their minds around, right? Like, what is the process now that I'm not using spreadsheets and Word templates? Like, what does that look like for me? So this was extremely valuable, I think, Lyf, and I really appreciate you sharing this with us and our team. And if anyone is interested in reaching out to you, contacting you, is there a good way to do that?
Yeah, they can, my email's easy, Lyf@mytech, mytech.com. They can reach out to me or hit our website at mytech.com. None of this is secret sauce. It's just hard work putting
Yeah,
this together and thinking about, whatever process you're doing, you got to get it somehow on paper so you can first iterate it effectively, but then replicate and help your team be able to understand what the full life cycle looks like.
yep,
Some of this was that we did just because we wanted to start to scale differently. And once I have more than one person playing a role, you got to get it out of tribal knowledge and
right,
into formalized knowledge that your team can use.
right. I mean,
Whether you're doing it
there,
in Visio or wherever, it doesn't matter.
right. I mean, I think there was so much good stuff in this conversation. So again, I really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time, and thanks again for being a ScopeStack partner with us.
Yeah, we love it.
Hey, John here from ScopeStack. I'm often asked, why ScopeStack? Why did you build this thing? What are you doing? Well, it's mainly because my background is in pre-sales, and I did spend a lot of time scoping professional services, and the main tools which we used to do that were Excel and Word. Now, these are two disjointed mechanisms that have no context for each other. So really the premise around ScopeStack is, how do we create a platform that combines those two functions? There's now context for making a level of effort decision in ScopeStack, as opposed to making it in Excel and then having to make a change in Word and having to manage those two documents in completely separate fashion. So ScopeStack's here to solve that problem, make it a lot more efficient. If you're interested in learning more, check out scopestack.io and request a demo. We'd love to talk to you.